Okay, everybody. Here we go. We are week number I believe this is week number 5. Uh at the end of this class, we will be halfway through the course. Um you may notice here a few. I don't know what it looks like on your end when I pause the recording and start it back up. But you may notice a few more of those here because I am going to try very hard this course to really go through some of the specifics of how all the stuff we've been talking about psychoanalysis and neurology and that intersection, including the book, the articles, where that fits, because I, I, I am hoping that you take from this. As I've said, this is not a class that is meant to make you psychoanalysts or even to reinforce the whole idea of um, the whole idea of psychoanalytic thinking, but it really is looking into the whole relationship of how uh, the complexity of the psyche, the complexity of the mind, the complexity that psychotherapy tries to address fits in with the neurology, the behavioral neuroscience. One criticism I have of neuropsychology is it tends to be too reductionist, meaning it says a part of the brain, this runs this part of the brain, this runs this part of the brain, and you can map it out. And certainly, the fact that a lot of what we do as human beings is in our brain somewhere is true. We're seeing that through the course, but I think that a lot of more straight text on neuropsychology tend to make it too simplistic. That's basically what the word reductionist means. You may notice you notice in the Lacan article that I have that a lot of psychoanalysts, including some argue Lacan, would say that uh, neuropsychoanalysis uh, misses the point. Um, that it's by reductionist, it means that it tries to simplify the human psyche too much. It tries to simplify why human behavior is basically reduced to certain parts of the brain light up, and um, we um, uh, we act a certain way because one part of our brain is lit up, and that's what happens. If this part gets lit up, then this happens. If these two parts get lit up at the same time, this happens, and it can be all like that. Now, Lacan, the psychoanalyst in the one article that you read, who again I picked because Jacques Lacan, I think, is the most recent author that uh, sort of has an overall psychoanalytic theory. You've seen in the article that it describes as a meta psychology. And meta psychology is generally used to describe a psychological theory that has two levels. One is it sort of tries to explain everything, but also it is it makes reference to thinking about thinking or learning about learning, meaning a meta psychology addresses one goal it addresses is helping people understand why they are thinking what they are thinking. So it's not just sort of a textbook or a workbook type thing of like, okay, you feel anxious because this and this, but to address the types of thought or the types of experiences that are causing the anxiety, and then having the person think about, well, why am I thinking that way, or why am I feeling that way? So it's not instructional as much as it's experiential. It's not just telling you what your thoughts are, but helping you think about why you're thinking the way that got you to those thoughts. So again, that's why I picked Jacques Lacan, and also because it was the most recent article I found in a neuropsychoanalytic journal that made reference to the neurology of it. Um, but the overall view there, one thing they bring up in the article is that even Lacan made reference to the brain. So I think there's an argument that psychoanalysts would not see it necessarily as being reductionist, to think that that behavioral neuroscience can connect with um, uh, clinical psychology. Of course, we've mentioned multiple times here that Freud was a neurologist. Freud certainly believed this all related to um, neurology. It's probably more along the lines of, there's a famous saying by B.F. Skinner, who um, said that we can understand all human behavior if we just understood all the variables that affect behavior. And although that seems like a very solid statement to make, if you think about it, it's not a real practical one. Or one could say that it's a reductionist view of behavior, but in many ways, if you think about it, it's more a reflection of the complexity of behavior, because it's that saying of, or it's that part of it where he's saying, if we understood all the variables. Well, of course that's true. The question is, how many variables? How do you know when you have all the variables? There may be millions, if not billions, of variables that affect everything we do. So, in a way, the statement sounds reductionistic, but in another way, it's very much a reflection of the complexity of human behavior. So, having said that, we then get to this idea of, with neurology and behavioral neuroscience, that we can only, as we look at neuropsychoanalysis and the research there, we can really start to see where um, there are a lot of different things happening in the brain. There's a lot of, so it's not just a matter of how the brain, uh, how the different parts of the brain operate, but it's the neural traces that we talked about last class, the how they're connected, how the neurons are firing, what neurochemically is going on with them, and how much dopamine or how much serotonin is in them, which we will talk about later. But those are the neurochemicals that often account for depression and anxiety. Um, how the different parts of the brain interact with it, how they're wired. So it's not only what parts of the brain function where, but it's also how they interact with each other, which is on multitudes of different levels. Um, and so we are seeing that in a lot of the material that we read and talk about in here. So I wanted to delve more into that. So let me just go through. I got some notes here I want to start with. Uh, so let's take uh, let's take a look at Lacan. I'm going to start with the article that you read on Lacan, and Lacan splits the psyche into three different fragments, three different parts, similar but not exactly the same as Freud's ego, id, and superego. Um, and the one thing that Lacan says about the brain is that the brain doesn't really adapt very well. And and in order to understand that, you have to understand that Lacan really is seeing this mind brain connection, but the mind is more of uh, more what helps us live as human beings. The brain is there just to sort of get us started, and then the mind adapts. Now, what you could say, part of what um, sort of happens here is um, Lacan seems to be defining mind as something beyond what the brain is doing. Now, the argument would be from another law neurologist is that the mind is actually impacting the brain by a series of very complex neurological interactions. So, all this stuff about neural traces and neuroplasticity, all of those aspects of the brain are adding to this high level of complexity of how the brain functions. But in Lacan's point of view, the brain itself is sort of the starting place, and the brain is very limited, and that it doesn't really adapt real well. And it's sort of up to the mind to help us adapt to what our experiences bring to our brain. But even uh, even the uh, even Lacan sees the brain as playing a major part. To him, the cerebral cortex is sort of the center of this part of the brain that people start off with. Um, and as you read this article, this is a good place to start. So, what Lacan presents, and this would sort of be consistent with a lot of um, research, is that when an infant starts off, they perceive the outside world as actually being part of themselves. So they take in what's going on around them. But what has happened as in infancy is all this stuff is coming in, and it's only over time that the infant starts to recognize that this is not part of them, or meaning part of the infant. The infant sees the outside world and just thinks that's a reflection of who they are, that they're directly connected to this whole um, uh, what is an external reality, but they are taking it in, and that sort of forms the basis of later on when they recognize that they are separate from the outside world. This sort of initial mirror impression that they have um, forms the base of how they respond later on when they acknowledge and start to recognize that these outside parts are all a separate reality, that they are interacting with the parts, but that the parts are not of them. And so uh, and so there is this overall gestalt that the infant feels, and they aren't really able to separate themselves from that gestalt. So and so what happens is, and then later on, that helps them form uh, a feeling of safety. I mean, if an infant is growing up and their needs are being met and blah blah, all the good stuff that infants are supposed to go through, then when they start to realize, oh, I'm not directly connected to these other parts. These are not part of me. They are separate, and I have to interact with them rather than them being part of me. It's not such a big deal. It's like, okay, you when you develop what would quote unquote be normal, you start to see this sort of separation um, as or at least physical distinction, as being safe. Well, as your perception of the, it's basically what what is the emotional response when you start to realize that the world is not exactly how you thought it would be. And if you think about it, that's kind of the basis of how we live our lives. What happens when the world isn't exactly how you thought it was. How do you deal with that? And quote unquote healthy ways of dealing with it is you deal with it where it's like, okay, well, things are different, and I'll adapt to it. But that sort of base of how we view the world is seen in Lacan, and there's evidence for us. It's in the cerebral cortex, which is a very general statement, but Lacan even makes some reference to it. In the Lacan article, and when they get into the neurobiological stuff, it's useful to remember that the authors are connecting updated neuroscience with what Lacan said. Lacan didn't have that deep an understanding of neuropsychology. Okay, so now just to generally with Lacan, there is this symbolic where this is what the child, the infant, develops their view of the world prior to the time they can use language. So the child is developing a view of the world that doesn't really that that is sort of a straightforward, unambiguous view of the world, but turns out to, as they develop, they're realizing isn't correct. It's not answering everything that's happening. And what's interesting about Lacan's view is um, that 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 the whole process of unconsciousness and the whole process of how the psyche works is there's this gap between what we experience internally, or how we view the world, and what we run into externally. And oftentimes that's something we don't have language for, and that's where the unconscious comes in. So Lacan, symbolic, what develops before language develops, and that's a fascinating part of neuropsychology, which is um, how does the child develop this view of the world prior to the time that they can use language to have any control over the world. And then what comes next. So there's the symbolic. I'm sorry. There's the imaginary. I'm sorry. That's uh, the first stage, the one where the child develops this view in the cerebral cortex of the world being part of themselves. That's the imaginary. That sort of forms the basis for what comes later. Um, the symbolic is where language starts to develop, and language allows the child to have some more uh, control over the world, able to get these desires to want to be able to control things, to want to have rule over their whole environment, um, helps keep it in check. It's almost like now you've got the superego where the child learns rules, rules of language, rules of social interaction. So you've got the imaginary where this is sort of like just entirely driven by the child's view of the world as part of themselves. That you couldn't even say they have control over, because it's more than that. It's like it's part of themselves, and that's the imaginary. And then you move into, as the child gets older, into the symbolic, where they start to use language as a way of having some um, uh, uh, control over the world. And part of that control comes from learning what the rules are. Okay, this part of the world is external to me, so I'm going to start learning these rules of how to interact with the world. And that's the symbolic part. And then the real is as they get older and you start to realize that there's limitations even to language. And that unconscious is the things that impact our behavior, that is that we don't even have words for. Words don't actually control everything and don't give us control over everything. So even though we have this base view in our cerebral cortex of the world that's connected to all of us, um, there's still these empty patches where we're clearly impacted by something, but we don't have words for it. Now, where I wanted to go before I go, because I know we're a little off the neurology here, and the behavioral neuroscience, I'll get back to it. But why I wanted to tie it all together is I wanted to make a brief note of how this is part of like every type of psychotherapy. Every type of psychotherapy, and I mentioned this last live class, has to some degree this emphasis on making what is nonverbal verbal. Uh, Cognitive behavior therapy is almost essentially about that. They don't use the term unconscious, but there clearly is a strong verbal aspect to cognitive therapy. You are using verbal speech to talk yourself through. Skinner, who who talked to who saw this all as behavior therapy, but even there used the difference between covert and overt behavior. Overt is behavior where I'm talking to you. Covert is where I'm talking to myself. So even at the very start of cognitive therapy, which would be B.F. Skinner, who didn't even call it cognitive behavior therapy, said it was all behavior therapy, but still had a cognitive aspect. It was just that internal speech follows the same role as external speech in his view of the world. Um, Freud, of course, talks about the id, ego, and superego, which is very similar to that. Object relations is another aspect of psychoanalysis. But what we are looking, so in object relations therapy or object relations psychoanalysis, we are being more realistic about what we expect from these other people, about what we really can expect, what we really can look for when we are dealing with other people. One of the more Freudian psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, object relation psychoanalysis all have this idea of we are looking for things from other people, and how do we go about, and many times what we are looking for from other people is part of this unspoken um, part of our brain slash mind that doesn't have words. And often, and what psychoanalysis often is about is bringing words to those parts of our mind that don't have words. um, Carl Jung said that the whole purpose of psychoanalysis, and in his view, psychoanalysis was the same as therapy, was bringing the what is unconscious into the conscious. And you could certainly say that that's the goal of all types of psychoanalysis. And where that fits in with the behavioral neuroscience is how does this, what do we know neurologically about how this non conscious works? And we know that it doesn't have language. And so, very often, the most common step that we are trying to do in therapy is give language to the internal experiences that are reflecting something going on in our unconscious. But it doesn't just apply to psychoanalysis. Behavior therapy and cognitive behavior therapy across the board focuses on uh, uh, bringing words to what we are experiencing. Acceptance, and commitment therapy uh, is a it's called the third wave of behavior therapy. And it brings into ACT is a type of therapy that brings into the discussion what is called contextual behavior science, which is we help people give context to what they are experiencing. Because one of the limitations of the brain, and then this again, we go back to Lacan, one of the limitations of the brain is we tend to want to make sense of things, and we make sense of things by grouping them together to things we've already experienced. Um, Remember that from the Schwartz book, uh, she talks about the author of the book, The Dreaming Brain, who was sort of opposed to the whole neuropsychoanalysis point of view of dreams. And he talked about how dreams are actually an evolution, almost an evolutionary mistake. Well, not a mistake. As I said, evolution, one of the things that's often misunderstood about evolution is evolution was never presented as being good or bad, it just is. But that for some reason, what happens in our brain, as far as he was saying with dreams, is we go to sleep and we have this, sort of waterfall of of or water spout of neurons that just get fired out as we go to sleep, and they have no real connection as is, but our prefrontal cortex is geared towards making sense out of everything that comes in. So uh, so it tries to tie together all these things, and that's why we get these visual representations that we call dreams. They're internal because it's sensory material that the prefrontal cortex is used to trying to make sense of. It just makes sense of it um, in the same way it would make sense, try to make sense of things if it was external, except it's all internal. That's the prefrontal cortex. Um, and a lot of behavior therapy, third wave behavior therapy, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, functional analytic psychotherapy, dialectical behavior therapy, is helping people to not feel they have to make sense of things the way they've typically gone about making sense of things. And what I mean by that is typically the way we make sense of things is we make reference to previous experiences and try to group them all together. The idea with a lot of acceptance and commitment there, a lot of third wave behavior therapies is you help the individual take each experience as a unique experience and not necessarily related to everything before, because that's one of the limitations of the brain as opposed to the mind. And that's sort of what Lacan meant by the brain not being adaptable. The brain doesn't work real well with um, not connecting present experience to something that happened in the past. That's we often would um, we would almost define that as learning on a basic level. That's what learning is. You learn one experience, you connect it to something in the past, and you sort of build on it. Third wave behavior therapy is often identify the whole issue and reinforce the whole issue of taking each experience as a unique experience and not necessarily relating it to what happened before, or at least allowing a new experience to be a new experience and set the stage for reference to other new experiences, as opposed to saying, well, this is just like what happened to me when I was 12. And so I'm going to go back to that learning because that's what I learned. That's what I'm comfortable with. But instead, getting the person to say, no, you're going to take this as a brand new experience. The brain doesn't do real well with that without practice. Even existential and humanistic psychotherapy talks about this gap of between between our experiences, what we have words for, and things that we don't have words for. Um, and so now, usually in existential and humanistic psychology, it's not described as an unconscious; it's described as a search for meaning. uh, we are, the whole um, hierarchy of needs. We're ultimately this goal of feeling we are the best person that we can be. That's not something we necessarily have words for, because if we did, then there would just be a rule book that says, well, this is what you have to do to be the best person you can be. So, but we in existential and humanistic therapy, the idea is that it's in us somewhere. we're all sort of directed towards trying to find meaning and purpose with ourselves, or um, if you go back to this whole idea of the child being connected, um, seeing the whole world as physically connected, it's the sort of the humanistic view would be that what's happening there is that the child, the infant, has just an infantile um, uh, idea of what it means to be connected. So the child is starting with this connection that they are physically connected, that the rest of the world is physically connected to them. And that's not correct. That's an infantile. That's again going back to the cerebral cortex. That's a very basic view of what it means to be connected. But that what we search for the rest of our life is more of a spiritual connection with the rest of the world. Um, uh, and then going back to psychoanalytic theory, um, there's this idea that there is a connection that we have with not only the rest of the universe as it exists now, but the rest of the universe as it's always existed. And that's the Carl Jung view of the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is this unconscious that's developed throughout time, that connects us not only to what's going on now, but what's going on in the past. And Jungian theory often sort of uh, crosses over into what some of the humanistic and existential people talk about. So on all these levels, you've got this difficulty of the nonverbal part of our brain, and that's something that uh, neuropsychology often misses or doesn't give enough weight to, because it's only looking to explain the brain. But when, just as this one unit, but when you sort of see more of a mind brain connection, you can see that, well, the only really to really explain what we do as human beings is to see the brain as not only being these different parts that all light up when things happen, but see this multiple level of complexity in terms of how the brain interacts. Okay, so as we move on through all of this, what I'd like you to try to make sure you're piecing together is how all of this material um, that we're bringing up is material that relates to the distinction, or relates to the connection between what's going on in our brain and how we are feeling emotionally. But it doesn't just apply to psychoanalysis. It could apply to all the different um, uh, uh, theoretical models. And when you get to the Lacan article, one thing I'm hoping that you see there is they are actually making the argument, and I'm not always sure neuropsychologists would agree with this, but that neuropsychoanalysis is essentially the study of the mind. That it's neuropsychologist, that it's only the study of the mind where there is an emphasis, and this is according to what these authors are saying, that there is an emphasis on the interconnectedness of the different parts, and that neuropsychology tends to emphasize more um, the different specific areas of the brain, tends to be more focused on localization, and then neuropsychoanalysis um, focuses on the interconnection. Now, I would this just going back to what I've been saying throughout the course. I would not necessarily agree that neuropsychoanalysis is the only field that really emphasizes the study of the brain, which is being defined as the study of how all these areas are interconnected. However, I would say, and you may remember me saying this even from the beginning, that there is this distinction between clinical neuropsychology. The neuropsychology to me is split into two fields: clinical neuropsychology, which I would see as very focused on localization, and behavioral neuroscience, which I would say is more emphasizing how the different areas are interconnected. Um, and even as a clinical field, um, behavioral neuroscience, I would say, is more connected to what has been known as behavioral neurology. And all of those fields are studying the interconnectedness. So you almost could see, although it's not absolute, but you almost could see where those two areas I talked about way at the beginning, the clinical neuropsychology and the behavioral neuroscience, are, you see that split in the clinical neuropsychology is more understanding how are these areas, what do each of the areas of the brain do, and behavioral neuroscience is more on how are they interconnected, because it's only through that interconnection that we can really understand why human beings do what they do, because it's much more complex than can be understood with just understanding what different areas of the brain do. Okay, so let's delve into some of those areas that are important for understanding how the different parts of the brain interact. We already talked about neural traces, and neural traces is basically referring to how neurons change um, as the human goes through different experiences, and that experiences can change um, neural traces, either in terms of where they're located, in terms of what sorts of neurochemicals are released, in terms of how they're released. All those things can be impacted by neural traces. And what we know is neural traces can be impacted um, not only based on external reality and what's going on out there, but also on internal reality and how the person is processing things, how they are experiencing things. And those are all part of what makes up the impact of neural traces. Now, when we also delve into this whole idea of um, human development, human behavior, human emotions, there's this idea of drives, that we are all born with these with these drives that um, come from the mind and impact on bodily needs. And those drives, you may remember from Schwartz's book, she talks about the difference between a drive and an instinct. An instinct is typically seen as having one specific um, target. Instinct being, for instance, a cat going after a mouse. There's one. A drive is more of a general motivation for something to happen within the body, and basically, it's seen. One of the main concepts used to describe a drive is a term used in the Lacan article of homeostasis. That drives are meant to keep sort of this equal level of different things going on in the body. That the body is um, directed by drives for keeping a sort of equilibrium in terms of things that are going on. Um, and um, these drives are represented through bodily needs, although there isn't a, the sort of understanding is that they go beyond just bodily needs, but they're often represented um, in terms of bodily needs. So, for instance, saying that we want to, there could be argued that there is a drive for keeping a certain level of salt in the body. That's an example that's brought up in the article. But there also is this argument that there is a drive to keep a certain level of affect, of emotional equilibrium. And that emotional equilibrium, as we know, is represented through um, neurochemistry. So basically, when we are at emotional equilibrium, we feel that emotionally. We feel that by what's going on in our brain, and there is a corresponding neurological um, uh, mechanism by which that occurs. So there's a drive for maintaining equilibrium emotionally as much as there's a drive for maintaining equilibrium physiologically, and they're all seen as represented through physiological mechanisms. Um, the needs uh, for um, doing anything regarding um, maintaining this sense of equilibrium, whether it's equilibrium that comes up through emotional experiences or through physiological experiences, are seen as being centered in the brainstem and what is called the diacephalon, diencephalon, um, and then the hypothalamus kind of monitors um, whether there is equilibrium. So the hypothalamus and the brainstem interact. The brainstem sort of monitors whether there's a change in the equilibrium, and then um, um, the brainstem sort of triggers there being a need for to do something about it. Um, so and it goes basically they interact with each other. Um, and I'm sorry, it kind of goes the other way. The brainstem is where the need for any sort of change is triggered, and then the hypothalamus sort of sends out the signal to do something about it. So the brainstem connects with these other parts of the brain to sort of make to sort of signal that this equilibrium is needed. Those parts of the brain come back to the brainstem, and if there's a problem, that problem is then shot out to the hypothalamus, which then monitors um, the level, and then once equilibrium has been established again, it's then shot back to the brainstem. When it comes to emotional material, one area that that plays a big role is called is in the article the PAG um, system, uh, and the PAG system. Um, and I'm sorry, I was practicing again, trying to say it, but it's para aqueductal gray um, system, the PAG system. But that's the system that is connected to this hypothalamus brainstem uh, uh, section, and um, the PAG is often used for telling the body whether there is pleasure or pain. So this whole idea of us feeling um, emotional distress comes from the PAG system that is sort of connected to the brainstem slash hypothalamus section to determine whether the person is experiencing pain or is experiencing pleasure. And it's meant to sort of keep this level of equilibrium uh, going. And so when we are motivated to do things that we find positive or negative, it's often mediated through this PAG um, system. And again, it's not always the connection isn't always something that we're conscious of. There are these neural traces that can be impacted by experiences that could be internal, external, and that we may be conscious of, but most often we are not conscious of, and they can be triggered by, notice how, again, how all these areas are connected, because what it can be triggered by are these could be immediate emotional experiences um, uh, going on in the amygdala, which is where a lot of fear. So you could see that the amygdala gets triggered by an experiences, shoot something over to the PAG system that says we're in a level of emotional distress here, emotional displeasure. Um, and then that kicks it back to the hypothalamus um, brainstem system that says, okay, the equilibrium is off. We have to work to bring it back. And then this whole sorts of system goes on, again, interacting with the PAG system to try to bring the equilibrium back. And that's where emotional distress comes from. And you could see how that's all impacted by these neural traces, which can be experienced from the amygdala to the PAG system, that could be triggered either by something going on externally or something going on internally. I'm gonna have to break now, so I'm gonna stop the recording here, but I'll probably pick this up. I'm planning to pick this up with another short presentation a little bit later.